the temptation for things like military conquest begins to rise. If you look back at sort of Hitler's calculus in the 1930s, a lot of this desire for Lebensraum and kind of conquering parts of that what was then the Russian, the Soviet Union, was getting key resources and commodities for the German people that they couldn't get through other means. So I do think that there's two very, very different futures that we could be headed toward in this block-based economy, and I certainly hope we're in the former rather than the latter.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager due diligence or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we will have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager, Niels Kaastrup Larsen.
For me, the best part of my podcasting journey has been the opportunity to speak to a huge range of extraordinary people from all around the world. In this series, I have invited one of them, namely Kevin Coldiron, to host a series of in-depth conversations to help uncover and explain new ideas to make you a better investor. In the series, Kevin will be speaking to authors of new books and research papers to better understand the global economy and the dynamics that shape it, so that we can all successfully navigate the challenges within it. And with that, please welcome Kevin Coldiron.
All right, thanks Niels, and welcome everyone. So, over the last 25 years, the U.S. has come to rely on economic warfare to confront global crises. The key to that strategy is control over choke points, areas of such vast importance that economies struggle to operate when access to them is cut off. But what are these choke points? Well, there's the US dollar, there's advanced semiconductor technology, and there's even things like services that underpin the global trade in oil. And today we're going to explore the details of how this process operates and how the reactions to it are going to change the world economy. And we're going to base our discussion around a brand new book called Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. The author and today's guest is Edward Fishman. Edward currently teaches at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. He's worked in several positions that put him at the center of the U.S. effort to essentially weaponize the world economy. He served on the team at the U.S. State Department that designed and negotiated Western sanctions against Russia after it annexed Crimea. And he's advised the Secretary of State, he's advised the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also the top sanctions officials at the U.S. Treasury Department. So he's the perfect person to help kind of elucidate what's going on here, help us build our understanding. Edward Fishman, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Really great to be here with you today.
So to me, one of the really enjoyable aspects of reading the book was the feeling that you were kind of a fly on the wall for a lot of these very important discussions. And I know you say at the end of the book that you were a direct participant in some of these events, and that you were only able to really write this book because of the personal relationships and network with the participants that you've built up over the years. So I'm curious, maybe if we could just start with maybe a quick overview of your own career, how you got involved in working with the U.S. government, and how that led you into, as you say, being involved in some of these very important discussions about the applications of American economic power.
Sure thing. So, my story really begins as a college student in the years after 9/11. I was studying history and international relations, and, we learned in all of our classes that, the United States was the most powerful country on earth. We were living in a unipolar moment. But when I looked at the world, it just seemed like the United States was struggling to translate that power into getting what we wanted in the world. I think the biggest sort of examples of that were the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which quite quickly became these quagmires that were costing the U.S. untold blood and treasure with very little to show for it. And, this period sort of in the mid-aughts was sort of when Iran's nuclear program had become really the top national security problem that the United States was confronting. And, the United States had invaded Iraq to try to stop Iraq from getting a nuclear weapon. And, it was quickly found out that Iraq didn't even have a nuclear weapons program, whereas Iran had a real nuclear weapons program. And so it's really presented a pretty serious problem for anyone who wanted to work in foreign policy. It was, how do you stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? And it was really at this time that, U.S. government officials started experimenting with novel forms of sanctions and export controls, what I would classify as economic warfare, as really the primary vehicle to try to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So I became really interested in it and was lucky enough that, a week after graduating from college, moved down to Washington, D.C. to work for the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. So the official who oversees the sanctions apparatus at the Treasury Department. And that wound up being sort of my entree into this world. I eventually, as you said, wound up serving at the State Department, where I was on the Iran sanctions team there. Got to work on implementing the first Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Plan of Action, in November 2013. And then when Russia annexed Crimea a few months later in March of 2014, I shortly thereafter became the first Russia sanctions lead in the State Department's sanctions office. So I was part of the team that designed and negotiated the sanctions on Russia. And what these experiences taught me was, that these tools like sanctions and export controls and tariffs, they have really tremendous potential to try to to advance American interests. But we're really just scratching the surface in terms of their capability, and the U.S. government is still not very well positioned to do them strategically. So since leaving government, I've really devoted myself to studying these tools, trying to understand what makes them work when they don't work, how to reorganize the U.S. government to fight and win economic wars more effectively, and really to train the next generation of practitioners of economic warfare at Columbia, which is what I've been doing now for the last 4 years.
So kind of like the West Point of economic warfare.
That's our aspiration, Kevin. I think we're still probably in our infancy, but that would be a dream.
Do you imagine a potential for you going back and working for the government again in that capacity?
It's possible. I stay very close with folks in the U.S. government on both sides of the aisle. I've often been called in to advise on various matters of sanctions and economic statecraft. And it's possible I'd go back into government, but I also live in New York City. I've got 2 children. And so, you got to balance opportunities in public service also with family life as well.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that. That's really good context. So let me take a step back. I mean, the first part of the book is a history, a little bit of choke points. And you say there that, economic warfare is not new. And in fact, the failures of economic warfare kind of are better known than its successes. So could you maybe just give us an example of past economic warfare that failed, and maybe more generally why we know the failures better than the successes, and then we can kind of use that to move into the modern age.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe one thing just to say off the bat is, I'm often asked, Kevin, whether sanctions work. And I always find that to be kind of a strange question, because no one ever asks, does military force work, right? I mean, sanctions and tools of economic warfare, they're just, tools of statecraft the same way that, military force is. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I think that inherently, economic tools are weaker than the use of military force, but they also, present a lot of benefits, right? You're not necessarily risking human life and blood and treasure. They're usually a lot easier to deploy. They're sort of a midpoint between diplomacy and the use of military force. But yes, you're right that the failures of economic warfare are better known than the successes. And in fact, the very first kind of canonical use of sanctions happened in the 5th century BC. This was when Athens, Periclean Athens, so during the Golden Age when, Athens was sort of at the height of its power, imposed this wide-ranging trade embargo on a neighboring city-state called Megara. And the goal here really was deterrence. It was to show the rest of the Greek city-states, and in particular Sparta, that Athens, because of its dominant sea power, was so powerful that it could basically cripple Megara's economy. And it was not worth ever trying to attack Athens. And the irony of the situation is that the sanctions really worked. And Megara, I think Aristophanes, the playwright, reports in one of his plays that the Megarians were basically slowly starving because of this embargo. But the irony is that it actually encouraged Sparta to go to war with Athens because, I think the Spartans saw the Athenians as reckless, and that basically their power had to be brought to heel. And this has happened, other times in history. I think the more recently, the U.S. Oil embargo on Japan in the lead up to Pearl Harbor. Some people blame that oil embargo basically for incentivizing the Japanese to attack the United States. And I think probably the lesson here isn't that economic warfare can't work. It's that it's a really powerful tool, and you shouldn't use it without being serious about it. You got to mean it, and you have to realize that it is. An aggressive. It can be quite aggressive, and can is part of an escalatory ladder that sometimes leads to military force. I think the biggest change, though, Kevin, between all of these historical examples of economic warfare, all the way back to Athens in the 5th century BC to the U.S. oil embargo on Japan in the 1940s, is that they always required the use of military force to implement, right? So Athens was able to blockade Megara because of its navy, and the same was true of the U.S. Navy in the 1940s. What's changed really only in the last 20, 25 years is that because of this hyperglobalization we saw in the 1990s and the creation of the chokepoints you mentioned before, coupled with the really extensive reach of the American regulatory state, we now have a situation where an official in OFAC, which is the Treasury Department agency that oversees sanctions, can effectively sign a document in an office in Washington, D.C. and employ sanctions and embargoes that are even more powerful than the ones that were implemented throughout history using naval blockades and UN sort of mandates. And so I think that's the thing that's really new about today's economic warfare. It's that it can be done through the stroke of a pen. It doesn't actually require sending out the U.S. Navy to implement it.
You talk about that in the book in the sense of how recent a development that truly is. There's a character, one of the main characters in the book is Stuart Levy?
Stuart Levy, yeah, exactly.
Stuart Levy, yeah. And there's a great quote from him where he says, well, when I started my job in 2004, I don't think the National Security Advisor would have even taken my call. By the time I left, I could get the president to sign an executive order within 4 hours of deciding it was worth doing. So that's, I think he was there for less than a decade, and he accumulated kind of enormous influence. I was wondering maybe if we could use his experience as a way to kind of talk about the evolution of the power of sanctions. Can you tell us about him and what were his insights that he had that other people hadn't in terms of the use of economic power?
Yeah, no, Stuart Levy is kind of, I would say, he's the through line of the book. He's right there at the beginning and out there all the way to the end. I call him the Zelig of the age of economic warfare. He sort of.
I'd like that reference, by the way.
Yeah, he appears in all these different guises. I hope readers of the book, don't think that that's an exaggeration. So look, Stuart Levy was a young lawyer at the Justice Department on 9/11. He was in his 30s. Went to Harvard Law School, and was very, very smart, and sort of had developed this understanding, I think, of how the private sector viewed risk. It was really sort of more of a into regulation as opposed to a foreign policy, national security type of a person. And after 9/11, started working on terrorist financing cases at the Department of Justice. And when this new sort of Treasury Department organization, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, was created in sort of the aftermath of 9/11, Levy was asked to become the first head of it. And so he was given this job sort of at the tail end of Bush's first term. So this is in 2004. I think he accepted it largely because, he wasn't even sure Bush was going to be reelected. So he said, might as well take a flyer on a startup and see how it goes. And so he assumes this job. Of course, Bush gets reelected. And when, really shortly after Bush is reelected, so I think in December of 2004, he's asked about Iran, because by then, everyone is really focused on Iran's nuclear program. And Bush gives this comment saying, sanctions, we've tried sanctions against Iran, but they haven't worked. And we've sanctioned ourselves out of influence with Iran. And, there's Stuart Levy, young sort of lawyer just taking over this new group at the Treasury Department, who kind of takes this as a challenge from the president. Says, well, let's see if we can make sanctions work against Iran. And what he really comes up with is sort of using some of this knowledge he had developed as a lawyer, both in private practice and the Department of Justice, which is that, banks around the world make risk-based decisions in terms of who their clients are, who they do business with. And I think up until really Levy's time, whenever the U.S. was trying to get other countries on board with sanctions, it was always through diplomacy. It was, going to the UN Security Council. And government, the Bush administration was always frustrated that it could never get the UN Security Council to agree to really aggressive sanctions on Iran. And what Levy realizes, he could short circuit that process and go directly and talk to banks around the world, not just banks in the U.S., because the U.S. had an embargo on Iran, but going to talk to banks in London and Frankfurt and, Tokyo and Hong Kong and Dubai. And so what Levy does is he basically creates this roadshow. He travels around, meets with, hundreds of different banking CEOs and compliance executives, chief legal officers all around the world. And what he does is he comes bearing these sort of like dossiers of declassified intelligence that shows exactly how Iran is using the international financial system to evade sanctions and also primarily to fund its nuclear weapons program, as well as its support for terrorist proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. And these banks, in the aftermath of 9/11, the last thing they want is, a front page article in the Wall Street Journal saying that, HSBC is involved in funding Iran's nuclear program, or, BNP Paribas is involved in, supporting Al-Qaeda. And so from just a sheer perspective of reputational hazard, a lot of these banks decide it's not worth doing any business with Iran after meeting with Levy. But then as this is happening, there's also sort of an increased effort to actually enforce these sanctions. And so some of the banks, of course, I think many of them do sort of get out of Iran, but some of them continue to do business with Iran. And what we wind up seeing is, the scale of penalties for sanctions violations just goes up by an order of magnitude. And so, banks, I think, up until really the late aughts, I think viewed sanctions violations kind of as a cost of doing business. Maybe they'd get slapped on the wrist, but it was worth it. But then you start seeing fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then by 2012, in the billions of dollars, you see $2 billion fine on HSBC, and then kind of this epic $9 billion fine on BNP Paribas in 2014. And so by that point, banks really, they can't just sort of write off sanctions violations as a cost of doing business. They have to take it seriously. And basically what Levy does, I think if you just look at it from a macro level, is he conscripts the international banking system to be these frontline infantry officers in American economic wars. And so what he does, it works. Iran is really the focus of his efforts. But as we see throughout the course of this book and over the last 15 years or so, this sort of these infantry can work whether it's Iran or Russia or China. It really doesn't matter. They're now conditioned, basically, the international financial system to implement American sanctions.
This is maybe going a little bit off piece, but as I was reading that section of the book and just listening to you make that description, I started thinking like, well, what type of person wants to end up as head of a bank now? Because you're almost, at some level, they're kind of they're semi-state actors, right? So it's almost like I'm wondering if your students are more likely to be running banks than, people coming out of, I don't know, the Haas Business School where I teach, right? I mean, it's people rise up through banks because of their skill in finance. But, when you get to the very top now, your skill as, or I don't know if skill is the right word, but you're having to deal with these kind of much bigger geopolitical issues that have nothing to do really with core banking.
I think that's right. I think that, what we've seen, and I think another macro story of the book is, it's sort of an ironic story, is that, a lot of these choke points are created through, financial deregulation and neoliberalism. A lot of them are created, honestly, in the wake of the deregulatory push of the 1980s under Reagan and Clinton in the 90s and WTO, et cetera. But then what happens is, after these choke points are created, it's the story of kind of the resurgence of state power, the state kind of reclaiming, the central role over the global economy, and saying that, yes, we want banks to make money, but really, not if it's, national security comes first, and they have to be complying with these laws. And look, I called Stuart Levy the Zelig of the age of economic warfare. After he leaves his job at Treasury, he does become the chief legal officer of HSBC, the largest bank in Britain, and is really kind of the number two there, where he winds up building this massive sanctions compliance apparatus that becomes a gold standard that other banks emulate. I think with over 1,000 people there. So I think you're right that geopolitics, compliance with sanctions has become incredibly central to the banking system. And I think the story that we're probably going to see now over the next 5 to 10 years is that that's going to become true in other sectors too, right? The technology sector, we've already seen, the semiconductor industry taking these issues really seriously. But yeah, I think it's the banking sector is probably the tip of the iceberg.
I think that's absolutely right, and that points to a world where it's a different form of capitalism. I don't know if we have a great name for it. Some people call it national capitalism. We'll find out. There's 2 points I really want to focus on with Iran. First, I wonder if you could explain to the listeners one of the key tools that I think Levy used, which was these escrow accounts. So basically, I think the insight was, hey, we can allow Iran to continue to sell oil and earn money from it, but we're going to prevent them from actually using the money.
That's exactly right. Yeah, look, I think this is probably the most single successful sanction we've seen in modern times. And what winds up happening, this is actually a few years after Levy leaves. I think he leaves the Treasury Department in 2011. By the time he leaves, there's this interesting dynamic that develops in Washington where, Congress is a bipartisan supermajority in Congress for really aggressive sanctions on Iran. So you have people like Mark Kirk, who's the senator from Illinois, Bob Menendez, a Democratic senator from New Jersey, who are pushing basically any as aggressive sanctions as they possibly can against Iran. And so folks in the Obama administration, the people who, many of whom Levy had trained and cultivated at the Treasury Department, start realizing, look, we need to figure out a way to turn up the heat on Iran even faster. And the one area that Levy never really gets to touch during his tenure is Iran's oil sales. And that's because there's always this fear that, Iran is a massive oil producer. They export 2.5 million barrels of oil on global markets each day at the time. If you try to take this oil off the market, first of all, you probably couldn't. But even if you could, you'd cause a spike in oil prices that would, damage the world economy, which is then, really at the beginning of recovering from the global financial crisis of 2008. What winds up happening is Congress is saying, you have to do something about oil. And so some of Levy's successors at Treasury, including Adam Zubin, who was his protege and became the head of OFAC, as well as David Cohen, who succeeded him as the head of TFI, come up with this strategy, which is, we can go around to banks in places like Tokyo and in various Chinese cities and in Seoul and in South Korea and say, look, if you are helping process a payment for Iranian oil, so if a refinery in China is buying a cargo of Iranian oil, you can pay for that oil, but only if it's into a central Bank of Iran account in your home country. And so what it does is it forces Iran to set up these bank accounts in places like China and India and Japan, and basically say, okay, well, we can accumulate our oil proceeds in these countries, but we can't repatriate them to Iran. We can only use them for bilateral trade in non-sanctioned goods. So theoretically, they could use all of those oil proceeds if they really wanted to import, millions of toasters from China, but they couldn't actually use them to buy whatever they wanted around the world. What winds up happening is, because Iran honestly cannot find ways to spend all of its oil proceeds in these countries, is within 18 months, you have roughly $100 billion of Iran's oil proceeds that have accumulated in these overseas escrow accounts. It's really remarkable, I think, because if you think about it, it's a unilateral sanction. This is not something where the UN has backed it. The EU has not backed the same sanctions. This is something that is just being done, at the behest of the US Congress and the Treasury Department. And it's working to effectively change the way that Iran is getting paid for its oil. And I think the reason that this sanction is so successful is a few of them. One is that it doesn't actually require Iran to, stop selling oil. They continue selling oil, so you don't have the market disruption that I mentioned earlier. But I think more to the point, once you get into nuclear negotiations with Iran, the US government has the ability to basically, sign a document and repatriate money to Iran and say, okay, Iran, you freeze your nuclear program. Okay, take $5 billion of your frozen oil funds, and you can have access to them. And that's how the original Iran nuclear deal happens. In November of 2013, the U.S. agrees to unfreeze, I think, roughly around $5 billion of those oil proceeds, and Iran agrees to freeze its nuclear weapons program. And so it's pretty remarkable. It's like you're almost taking another country's export revenue hostage, and then getting them to stop their nuclear program in order to get some of it back.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that because you do a good job of saying, at some point, it was like, okay, hey, we've reached the point of maximum pain. With these escrow accounts, there's not much more squeezing we can do. So now let's use these sanctions as a tool in a negotiating position, right? And so we want them to end their nuclear weapons program, and we can kind of dangle this ending the financial sanctions, freeing up the escrow accounts as part of that. And that becomes a key aspect of the Iran nuclear deal. But then Trump comes in and basically says, well, that's, I'm a limit, the deal's done, their deal's off the table. And so there's a kind of, my thinking was, well, hold on. If the real value of these tools is that they can be used in the negotiation to say, okay, we'll switch off the sanctions if you agree to do what we want. But if those deals can then be quickly undone, doesn't that actually undermine their value in the first place? Because why should I trust that you can deliver on on what you've agreed?
Yeah, that's a really important point, Kevin. And I think that Trump's decision in 2018 to unilaterally pull out of the nuclear deal. And by the way, this is while the International Atomic Energy Agency has verified that Iran is complying with the deal, where the other parties of the deal, so that's the Germany, the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, have all said that that Iran is complying with the deal. They're not pulling out. It does very significant damage, I think, to a paradigm of U.S. sanctions. The paradigm is that sanctions are a tool of behavior change. That basically we impose sanctions on a country, and those sanctions are kind of unnatural, and they're only in place until we get what we want, and then once we get what we want, we remove them. And that really had been kind of the model for sanctions up until 2018. I think that after Trump kind of unilaterally pulls out of the JCPOA, it makes it really hard for the U.S. to credibly put forward sanctions as a tool of behavior change. And you do see, the Iranian government shortly thereafter. Well, first of all, the President Rouhani, who had been elected basically to deliver the JCPOA, is discredited, and they wind up electing a hardliner to replace him a couple of years later. But I think more importantly, from the perspective of U.S. national security, Iran quickly reconstitutes its nuclear program and builds back its program to an even greater extent than it had been before the nuclear deal. So I think in retrospect, the Trump's pullout of the JCPOA was a real, I think, serious foreign policy blunder. I think even, hardliners in places like Israel, who I think had supported it at the time, have now come out and said that it was a big mistake. I think what's happened in the year since, Kevin, which touches on your point about national capitalism, or what kind of new global economy are we moving toward, is that sanctions have become less a tool of behavior change and more, honestly, a tool of remaking the global economy itself, right? And I think what you're seeing today is sanctions on countries like Iran, Russia, China. There's not really a behavioralist calculus behind them. It's not clear what China could do to get export controls removed, or what Russia or Iran could do to fully be reintegrated back into the world economy. And so we're really seeing is a lot of these tools like sanctions and tariffs and export controls. They're really building the foundations of a new economic order, one that is much less globalized, much more focused on geopolitics and national security. And I don't think we fully appreciated that, but I do think that 2018 and Trump's pullout of the Iran nuclear deal was a major turning point in that story.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that seems to be like an extraordinarily important point, because what you're saying is we can examine the export controls, the sanctions, and they're kind of like the I don't know, the gray contours of what the world economy is going to look like over the next 5 to 10 years. Just, it's like you're building a house and you've kind of got you're starting to put up the studs and you can kind of see what the house is going to look like.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And if you think about it, I mean, it's kind of a strange way to, you got to really do some mental gymnastics to get to this vision. But if you think about the 90s, building the globalized world economy, it was built really through these trade agreements, like NAFTA, the WTO, or giving China permanent normal trade relations with the U.S. It was really through bringing down barriers. Now, kind of the new global economy, which I don't think we have a name for yet, that's being built, is really being built through tools like sanctions and export controls and tariffs. It's being built through barriers. It's sort of a different process than the process we saw in the 90s. And while kind of the materials that we're using to build the house that you mentioned are different, I think we can't deny that that's what's happening right now.
I'd like to talk a little bit. We sort of both alluded to the export controls on China, and there's a couple, in the same way that the escrow account was an important kind of game-changing tool on the financial side. There's a couple of other tools that the U.S. has used more kind of on the physical trade side that are illustrated in your section on China. So, you tell the story of Huawei and ZTE, which we actually had Chris Miller on the show, and so we've talked through the importance of TSMC and Huawei, and you talk about the CFO of ZTE. So both Huawei and ZTE are telecoms equipment makers, broadly speaking, and the CFO of ZTE was caught with a plot to buy U.S. tech and then kind of resell it to Iran, and they were fined, but then they were later found violating the settlement, and they were hit with a, quote, denial order, which almost bankrupted them within a matter of weeks. So I was wondering if you could explain to the listeners what a denial order is and why that is such a powerful tool.
Sure. So, up until now in our conversation, Kevin, we've been talking about primarily financial sanctions, which, the Treasury Department and the State Department really are the ones who are administering it. The choke point that's being used there is the dollar, right? It's the fact that the U.S. dollar is used as kind of this way station in all major international transactions, or at least a very significant percentage of them. It's very hard to operate in the global economy without the dollar. A denial order is done by the Commerce Department, and it's not focused on finance, it's focused on trade. And basically what a denial order does, like the one on ZTE from 2018, is it tells U.S. exporters that they can't sell anything to ZTE. And some of the things that U.S. exporters might sell to ZTE are trivial. It could be a company that's selling tables to ZTE for their office space, which maybe may not be so painful for a company like ZTE. But then there are other products like semiconductors, which ZTE totally relies on, or at the time, something like the Android operating system, which if that is cut off from a phone maker or telecom equipment maker like ZTE, it can be really, really serious. And I think at the time, ZTE was really dependent on American microelectronics from companies like Qualcomm. And as a result, they did almost go out of business in a matter of weeks. And they would have, I think, had it not been for Xi Jinping placing a phone call to Donald Trump and basically saying, you really need to give ZTE a reprieve, and really kind of doing everything he can to get Trump to cave. And my understanding from talking to several people who were part of that conversation is that Trump agreed to it because he thought Xi Jinping might owe him one down the road. And so eventually, pretty quickly after this call, Trump instructs Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, basically to come to a deal that allows ZTE to survive. And so for a lot of folks, China hawks in the first Trump administration, they viewed this as incredibly frustrating because it felt like they were, just Xi Jinping maybe had, cajoled Trump in a way that, wasn't justified. But I think on the flip side of that is these China hawks in the Trump administration realized that, wow, some of these major Chinese industrial companies that are reliant on American semiconductors, we can really hurt them if we cut them off from U.S. products. And this was really important because I think financial sanctions against China have always been seen as a very significant action, something that, so far we haven't seen major financial sanctions against China. But I think these export controls were sort of seen as, okay, well, here's another really aggressive tool we can use. And so the ZTE case, while it winds up being short-lived, I think it provides a clue to people like Matt Pottinger, who was overseeing China policy at the Trump NSC, that this is a tool they can use to kind of spearhead the more competitive strategy that they wanted vis-a-vis China.
And then there's another tool called the entity list, which I think is kind of one level down. Can you just explain that? Because that's also been used.
Yeah, that's right. The entity list is one level down. It's also administered by the Commerce Department, by the Bureau of Industry and Security there. And what the entity list says is that you can export. An example here is that Huawei eventually is put on the entity list in 2019. And what that says is you can export things to Huawei, but you have to seek a license first. So it puts a regulatory barrier and gives, so it's at the very least, it slows down trade with the target. But usually the entity list also comes with a presumption of denial. So unless there's sort of clear exemptions written in, it's pretty close to being as aggressive as a denial order. It's just less black and white. It gives more flexibility to the Commerce Department to allow some licenses to be granted if they think that they're warranted.
One of the things that was kind of shocking in this section was kind of the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. And there's TSMC, which is the semiconductor manufacturing company. But of course, TSMC can't really operate without machines from ASML, which is the Dutch manufacturing firm that makes lithography machines to basically carve the chips. And it's the only company in the world that can make these ultra advanced lithography machines. So that they themselves have become a choke point. And at one stage, there was, I think this is in 2020, ASML was, going to sell one of their machines to a Chinese chip maker. And there was actually discussions in the U.S. that they should send the Navy to block the shipment.
Yes. Yeah. This is, I think the ASML lithography machine, I think it's one of the best examples you can find of a choke point that exists in the sort of physical world, because you really cannot produce advanced chips without access to these EUV machines that are only made by this one Dutch company. And so what the Trump administration, I think, realizes, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, they put the Huawei on the entity list in 2019. And while that does do quite a bit of damage to Huawei, the company recovers and they say, oh, well, we actually can continue sourcing chips from places like TSMC. Because if you think what TSMC is doing, TSMC is a foundry. So Huawei, their high silicon unit is designing chips that then are being manufactured by TSMC and being sent to China. And so, in an ideal world, the US government would just get, Taiwan and the Netherlands and all these other countries to agree to the same export controls that they have. But that's really, really hard to do for the same reasons it was hard for the US to get the UN Security Council to back really aggressive sanctions against Iran in the early 2000s. And so the Trump administration kind of starts looking for ways that they could do this unilaterally, kind of similar to, again, Stuart Levy trying to think about how could he isolate Iran without, getting every country in the world to agree to it. And what they come up with in May of 2020 is this tool called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, or the FDPR. And what that says is that, it's not just sort of US companies that can't sell things directly to Huawei. It's if you're a foreign company and you're selling chips, for instance, to Huawei, you cannot buy products from the United States and then sell chips to Huawei. So it basically gives companies like TSMC a choice. It's, you can either make products for Huawei or you can buy products from the United States. And by and large, the major chip makers, be it TSMC or SK Hynix or Samsung, after the Foreign Direct Product Rule comes out in the summer of 2020, they comply. And so this winds up becoming kind of like the Trump administration's version of secondary sanctions, that they're using the unilateral power of the American regulatory state and our control over technology choke points to really, cripple Huawei's access to frontier technologies. With ASML, we could apply the FDPR to ASML. What has happened, I think, is, the company came to a gentleman's agreement with the Trump administration in 2020. So they didn't have to send the US Navy, thankfully, after the shipment. And then I think what happened in the Biden administration is they actually got agreement with the Dutch government in 2023 to impose export controls and not approve the licenses for those EUV machines to be shipped to China. So what kind of started as a very aggressive unilateral policy was turned into a more sort of alliance-based diplomatic policy under the Biden administration.
I mean, it really underscores the fact that, the U.S. needs to have technological products that these other countries and companies need for these sanctions to be effective. Yes, that is very clear. And I think that's, maybe one of the dangers that we face if we are moving to, a world in which it's more of a state capitalist model. The reason that the U.S. possesses these choke points, it's not just because of the U.S. government, it's because of private industry. It's because of technological innovation. It's because of financial innovation, that created things like the SWIFT network, was created by a consortium of banks in the 1970s, or the correspondent banking system was created by American banks, and so I think that we, in order for the U.S. to maintain control over the most valuable choke points, we need U.S. companies to stay at the frontier of innovation. And I think that applies not only to physical technology like semiconductors, but also financial technology. And that's something, I explore toward the end of the book. We are seeing new mechanisms come up to settle cross-border payments without using the dollar, using things like central bank digital currencies. And I think, I'm concerned that the U.S. is a laggard in some of these areas, and we're not on the frontier the way that we were in the past. And so, that's one of the challenges, I think, about where we are today is, as we've put national security more at the foreground of our economic policy, we also run the risk of kind of losing control of some of these choke points over time if we're not innovating fast enough and getting our adversaries, frankly, hooked on our products. Yeah, it's we had Richard Holden on the show a couple of months ago, who's talked about the digital currencies and how the U.S. was definitely falling behind and China was on the lead there. But it does your other point is points to kind of this sort of irony in the sense that it was the kind of hyper competition of the globalized economy that led the U.S. to have these kind of world leading technology companies. Like, chip manufacturers moved from the integrated model to kind of offshoring or outsourcing production to places like TSMC, and then focusing on chip design. And people said that, well, we were losing our manufacturing capability, which is true to some extent. But then the flip side is that we got NVIDIA, and NVIDIA becomes one of the most important companies in the world. So it's like when you remove that hyper competition of globalization, are we still going to be able to develop these technologies that give us the power in the first place? That's I suppose it's a question we'll find out the answer to.
Yeah, look, I think the United States has always thrived when we've competed with the rest of the world, and I think that's been a big secret to American success. People ask, wait, why do we not have an industrial policy? Or, why are our tariffs so much lower than even European tariffs? Forget about the Chinese. And in some sense, I think we have had blind spots on our policy. We've allowed our defense industrial base, for instance, to atrophy. I think, and that has been a serious problem. But I think outside of a very, sort of select group of technologies that are fundamental to national security and warfighting, America has always done better when we have opened up our economy, when we've competed with the rest of the world, and frankly, when we've allowed our companies to set international standards. I think that's really critical because the reason we can use these tools as a coercive mechanism against foreign countries is because foreign businesses rely on American finance. They rely on American technology. And if we provide an incentive for these foreign countries not to rely on us, or worse, if we fall behind and our products aren't the best in breed anymore, that's a real problem. And I think to kind of go back to the Huawei example, part of the reason that Huawei was such kind of a psychological shock to the American national security establishment is that the reason it was winning market share across the world wasn't because China was holding a gun to foreign governments' heads and saying buy Huawei or else. It was because Huawei's technology had become best in class. They had the best in class 5G kit that was being sold for 30% less than the competition. And so, and we see this now in things like clean energy technology, where China very clearly has the lead, and their lead has become such a significant problem for the United States that the Biden administration saw fit to impose 100% tariffs on the import of Chinese electric vehicles into the United States. And so I think we need to be really careful about remembering that innovation, our technological capacity, our financial capacity really is, what underpins American power, both in economic warfare and more broadly.
I know we're kind of running out of time here. And, a lot of the book is focused on the U.S. Relationship with Russia, both in reaction to the invasion of Crimea, and then also, the annexation of Crimea, and then the invasion of Ukraine. And one of the, innovations, if you want to call that, that happened after the invasion of Ukraine was this kind of, I think you call it the service plus cap model. And that's not something that I fully appreciated, but it seemed to have been extraordinarily effective and kind of a backdoor way to get people involved who normally wouldn't want to come out and support sanctions on Russia. So I'm wondering if because it's so important, if you could just explain what that is and why it's been so effective.
Yeah. So, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, the U.S. and the rest of the G7 were intent on imposing really aggressive sanctions on Russia. And I think one of the challenges they had was honestly similar to the challenge that policymakers faced toward Iran in the early 2010s, which is, that Russia was a massive oil producer, 5 million barrels of crude oil and another 2.5 million barrels of petroleum products each day. And so there was really, a limit probably to how much pressure you could put on Russia without going after its oil sales. And I think quite quickly, the U.S. and the G7 hit that limit. They imposed sanctions on Sberbank and VTB, which are the two largest banks in Russia. They imposed the foreign direct product rule on Russia. So the same technology and semiconductor export controls that we talked about with Huawei, they're imposed on Russia as a whole. And so over the course of 2022, Russia's economy is definitely struggling under these sanctions and export controls, but the war is going on. And so it's quite clear that something needs to be done about Russian oil. And so what the U.S. And its allies come up with is this idea of a price cap, which is, that you can continue buying Russian oil. So if you're a Chinese or Indian refinery, you can import Russian oil. But if you use services from companies based in the G7, so for instance, if you use Greek shipping or British insurance or American trade finance, that you can only buy that Russian oil for a price below $60 a barrel. So it effectively imposes a cap on the price of Russian oil. And the reason that the U.S. and its allies think that this might work is because of these choke points that exist in the in energy supply chains, in particular the shipping sector, which is really dominated by Greece and several other European countries. The maritime insurance sector, I think 95% of all oil cargoes are covered by the International P&I Club, which is based in London, and then of course U.S. dollar and trade finance. But even when this price cap is imposed, I think there's still some anxiety that if it's done too aggressively, that you could see some Russian oil come off the market and you could cause a spike in oil prices, which is something the Biden administration is petrified about because of inflation running at 40-year highs and gasoline prices pretty high. And so what we see is really for the first 6 to 12 months of this policy being in effect, it works really tremendously well, and it cuts Russian oil revenues very substantially. But sort of in the vein of the conversation we had just before about where is this headed in the long term, it also creates a structural incentive for Russia to build its own end-to-end oil supply chain, to build buy old tankers that it can use basically as a substitute for the Greek shipping companies it used to use, or do sovereign guarantees instead of using British insurance. And so what happens is over time, Russia does find ways around this price cap by effectively indigenizing its energy supply chain. And I think where we are now is we're at sort of an impasse because the price cap is still in effect. Russia has, I think, successfully built workarounds to it. And the Biden administration never tightened it, I think, to the extent that it could be effective in the long term. And so I think one of the first big decisions the Trump administration is going to have to make on Russia is what to do about this policy. They could strengthen it pretty significantly by using some of the tools we talked about Iran with respect to Iran, like the escrow accounts, I think could work very well against Russia. But a lot of that will come down to the prioritization and whether they're going to take a risk in terms of energy prices.
Yeah, and it's led to a kind of a bifurcation in the oil market, which was for a long time kind of the ultimate globally traded commodity with a single price, and now we have multiple prices. And I just was wondering if you think that is what we're going to see with other markets around the world.
I think that's right. I think that you sort of hit the nail on the head, where barrel of oil was roughly the same price, whether it was coming from the Gulf of Mexico or Saudi Arabia or Russia up until 2022. And now you're starting to see really two oil markets. You see a market for regular oil and a market for sanctioned oil. And a part of the reason that countries like India and China have bought so much Russian oil is that they're getting it at a significant discount to Brent, which is the international benchmark. And I do think that to go back to our conversation about kind of building this new global economy that comes after globalization, I do think a hallmark of it is going to be that some of these markets that used to look like a global commodified market become really geopoliticized, where there are markets for Russian commodities that sell for discounts and can only go to countries that don't support sanctions, and then markets for commodities from countries that sell probably for a higher price but have a lower risk of incurring sanctions. So I do think that in many ways the oil market, by kind of coming under this grip of the national security state, points the way forward for what we're going to see in a lot of other markets in the years to come.
So this is a kind of an unfair question, I guess, but I'll ask it anyway. Is your vision or view of I don't know if the end game is the right term for where we end up, that it kind of mirrors the Cold War, where we have, two or three, we going to like an Orwellian world where there's kind of three big powers that don't really interact very much economically? Is that where we're headed? I mean, that's one argument, but then, the data says that global trade has actually held up remarkably well. So I don't know, like where do you think we are in 10 years?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think that almost certainly we are going to see some level of kind of blocks that form in the global economy. I think that there are different versions of that future, and we're not exactly sure where it's going to be. I think in the optimistic version of that future, you really see blocks that are formed really only around very strategic technologies and commodities. So maybe there's a semiconductor supply chain, or a supply chain for advanced semiconductors and military technology that exists only with the US and its allies. So this is kind of the friendshoring model. And then maybe another supply chain that China and Russia and some of what I would call the authoritarian axis has. And maybe in that world, you wind up actually with a more stable global economy, because you don't have necessarily the ability to coerce other countries through economic warfare, and you feel a little bit more secure. I think part of the reason you've seen such, I think, hawkishness on China in the US, both in the Democratic and Republican side of the aisle in recent years, is there's a real sense of vulnerability, that we're reliant on China for really strategic products that we can't get in a crisis. And I think we felt that viscerally during the worst part of COVID, when we couldn't even get masks because China kind of had produced was producing all of the world's masks. I think the bleaker version of that future, and it's the one that I'm particularly worried about with the Trump administration, if they do sort of go into this direction of, not only sanctions and tariffs against China, but also against Europe and Mexico and Canada and other, close US allies and partners, is that you have just a much more disorderly kind of breakdown of the global economy that probably doesn't happen overnight, just because, the US and China still have $600 billion almost in bilateral trade a year. You can't go from that to zero overnight, but you start to see more shortages, more inflation that just kind of becomes more of a regular part of our daily life. And then, of course, at the end of that, where are we left, right? We're left in a situation in which countries may not be able to get the critical resources they need through trade. They may not be able to, get the things they need through sort of peaceful commerce. And what has happened when that's happened historically is, the temptation for things like military conquest begins to rise. A lot of, if you look back at sort of Hitler's calculus in the 1930s, a lot of this, his desire for Lebensraum and kind of conquering parts of that what was then the Russian, the Soviet Union, was getting key resources and commodities for the German people that they couldn't get through other means. So I do think that there's two very, very different futures that we could be headed toward in this block-based economy, and I certainly hope we're in the former rather than the latter.
Well, thanks for that. I appreciate you taking the challenge of answering that question. I know it's impossible to answer, but I think these are things we should all be thinking about. And the book is a great kind of entree into just a deeper understanding, as we said, of the contours of the new world economy that are being built. You say toward the end of the book that trust once lost is not easily regained, and the scramble for economic security is underway. And we're not going back to where we were in the past. So, Edward, thanks so much for writing the book and for taking the time to talk about your ideas with us on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on, Kevin. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, the book is called Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And please go out and get a copy of Edward's book and make sure you follow his work, because I think, as you can tell from our conversation today, a lot of these ideas are not being discussed enough on mainstream media. For all of us here at Top Traders Unplugged, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.